The ocean doesn't care who you are. During the Second World War, more than 3,500 merchant ships and over 1,500 naval vessels were sunk in the Atlantic alone. In the Pacific, the numbers were just as staggering. Millions of tons of steel went to the bottom. But what about the people inside that steel? For most, a sinking ship was the end. For a few, it was the beginning of a story almost too incredible to believe. What does a person do when they find themselves alone in the middle of a hostile ocean? How long can the human body survive on rainwater and raw fish? What happens to the mind when it's pushed past every known limit of endurance, surrounded by sharks below and an empty sky above? These aren't just questions for a novel. They were the reality for thousands of sailors, airmen, and civilians between 1939 and 1945. Their stories are about more than just survival. They are about the strange, brutal, and sometimes beautiful mechanics of what it means to be human when everything is taken away. Number 18. What does it mean to be forgotten by your own Navy? The USS Indianapolis had a job to do. It was a secret job, a vital one. In late July 1945, the heavy cruiser steamed alone across the Pacific, having just delivered key components for the first atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. Her mission was complete. She was now heading for the Philippines for training exercises. The war was almost over. The mood on board was likely one of relief. But the war wasn't over for the Japanese submarine I-58. Just after midnight on July 30th, the I-58 found the Indianapolis sailing without an escort. The submarine's commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, saw the silhouette of a large warship against the moonlit water. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 of them hit home. The first blew off the bow. The second struck near a fuel tank and a powder magazine. The resulting explosion ripped the ship in half. The USS Indianapolis sank in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,195 men on board, around 300 went down with the ship. Nearly 900 men were thrown into the black, oil-slicked water. Many were badly burned or injured. They had life jackets, but little else. They believed rescue would come soon. A ship that large, that important, couldn't just disappear. They were wrong. Because of communication errors and a bizarre chain of bureaucratic failures, no one reported the Indianapolis overdue. The Navy simply lost a heavy cruiser. For the men in the water, the first day was about shock and trying to organize. They formed groups, clinging to each other and floating debris. The second day, the real horror began. The sun was relentless, thirst became an agony, and then the sharks came. The sinking of the Indianapolis is considered the largest single shark attack on humans in history. Men weakened and bleeding were easy targets. The attacks were constant, happening day and night. Survivors described hearing a scream, seeing a man pulled under, and then just blood in the water. But the sharks weren't the only enemy. The salt water, when swallowed by men desperate with thirst, induced a form of madness. They would hallucinate seeing phantom islands or imagining the ship was still floating just beneath the surface, offering fresh water and food. They would swim off towards these illusions, never to be seen again. Men fought each other over non-existent supplies. The groups of survivors began to shrink. On the 4th day, a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol happened to fly over. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, saw the oil slick, and then the heads bobbing in the water. He couldn't believe his eyes. He dropped a life raft on a radio and called for help. A massive rescue operation was finally launched. A PBY Catalina seaplane, commanded by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, landed in the open ocean against standing orders to pull the most desperate men from the water. He picked up 56 survivors, strapping them to the wings when the inside of the plane was full. When the rescue ships finally arrived, only 316 men were left alive. Almost 600 men had died in the water from exposure, dehydration, drowning, and shark attacks. The story of the sinking was a tragedy, but the story of the aftermath was a scandal. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, the ship's commander, survived the ordeal only to be court-martialed for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. He was the only captain in U.S. history to be court-martialed for losing his ship in an act of war. The Navy, many believe, needed a scapegoat to cover its own failures. Years later, haunted by the event and hate mail from grieving families, McVeigh took his own life. It wasn't until 2000 that he was posthumously exonerated by the U.S. Congress, thanks in large part to the efforts of a middle school student named Hunter Scott, who researched the story for a history project. The book In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton provides a definitive account of the entire ordeal. How many men exactly were killed by sharks versus those who succumbed to dehydration and saltwater poisoning? What was the precise nature of the intelligence failure that allowed a top-secret mission to end with the ship sailing unescorted through hostile waters? And what would have become of Captain McVeigh's life had the Navy admitted its own role in the disaster from the beginning? Number 17. Can a man with no training outlast the sea itself? Most survival stories involve groups, men and women leaning on each other, sharing rations, keeping spirits up. But some stories are about absolute solitude. Poon Lim's story is perhaps the most extreme example. He was not a trained sailor. He was a 25-year-old Chinese steward working on the British merchant ship SS Ben Lomond. He didn't have any special skills or knowledge of the sea. In November 1942, the Ben Lomond was sailing alone in the South Atlantic, far from any convoy. A German U-boat, U-172, found it. The torpedo struck, and the ship went down quickly. Poon Lim managed to grab a life jacket and jump overboard just before the ship's boilers exploded. He was the only one. He floated in the water for about 2 hours before he found a standard-issue wooden raft. It was about 8 feet square. On board was a small supply of essentials, a 40-liter tank of water, some biscuits, a few flares, and an electric torch. For the first few days, he rationed the supplies carefully, but he knew they wouldn't last. The vast, empty ocean stretched out in every direction. He saw other ships in the distance. He used his flares, but no one saw him. He was completely, utterly alone. When the biscuits and water ran out, Poon Lim had to improvise or die. He was not a fisherman, he was not a hunter, but he was resourceful. He used a wire from the torch to make a fish hook. He took hemp from the rope lining the raft and unraveled it to make a fishing line. For bait, he scraped barnacles from the bottom of the raft and crushed them, or he cut a piece of canvas and stuck it on the hook. At first, he caught nothing, but hunger is a powerful teacher. Eventually, he caught his first small fish. He drank its blood to quench his thirst and ate it raw. Life became a routine of survival. He built a small awning out of his life jacket for shelter from the sun. He created a system to collect rainwater, tying a knot in a line of rope and letting it drip into his water tank. His greatest challenge came during a storm that fouled his water supply and washed away his small stock of dried fish. He was near death, but the storm passed and he started again. He even managed to catch a bird that landed on his raft. He wrung its neck, drank its blood, and used the tougher parts of the bird as bait, which allowed him to catch a larger fish. He even fought a shark, a small one, but a shark nonetheless. He used the water jug, half filled with seawater for weight, as a weapon. After a long struggle, he managed to haul the injured shark onto the raft and beat it to death. He then sliced it open with a knife he had fashioned from a biscuit tin and dried its fins in the sun, a delicacy in his home country. After 133 days adrift, he saw land. He had drifted towards the coast of Brazil. 3 fishermen in a small boat found him. He had lost about 20 pounds, but was otherwise in remarkably good health. He could still walk. His story was so incredible that at first officials were skeptical. But he showed them his raft and explained his methods. The Royal Navy confirmed his account. He holds the world record for the longest time a person has survived alone on a life raft. The book Sole Survivor by Ruthann Lum McCunn tells his amazing story. King George VI even awarded him the British Empire Medal. What were the precise psychological mechanisms Poon Lim used to stave off the madness of total isolation for over 4 months? Did he talk to himself, create imaginary companions, or rely on a form of meditation we don't understand? How did his body's metabolism change to survive on such a strange and limited diet for so long? And did the crew of the German U-boat that sank his ship see him find the raft? And if so, what did they think? Number 16. What happens when an enemy tries to save you? The rules of war are supposed to be clear. You attack the enemy, you sink their ships, but what happens when the lines blur? What happens when an attacker becomes a rescuer? The Laconia incident is one of the most complex and tragic moral tales of the war at sea. In September 1942, the RMS Laconia, British troopship, was sailing off the coast of West Africa. It was not a warship, but it was a legitimate target. It carried about 2,700 people. This included British crew, soldiers, some civilians, but also, critically, about 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, guarded by Polish soldiers. The German submarine U-156, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein, found it and sank it with 2 torpedoes. As the Laconia went down, Hartenstein surfaced his U-boat to look for the ship's senior officers to capture. Instead, he found the water filled with thousands of struggling people, and then he heard them shouting in Italian. He realized he had just sunk a ship carrying allies of his own country. His duty as a U-boat commander was done. He could have sailed away, but he didn't. Hartenstein made a decision that would change the war. He began a rescue operation. He took hundreds of survivors from the water, cramming his own submarine full and towing several lifeboats. He then did something unheard of. He broadcast a message on an open radio channel in plain English, giving his position and asking for help from any ship in the area. He promised not to attack any vessel that came to assist, provided he was not attacked. The message was, if any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her, provided I am not being attacked by ship or air force. I picked up 193 men, 452 south, 1126 west, German submarine. The message was received by the British at Freetown. They didn't believe it, they thought it was a trap. But other German and Italian submarines heard the call and rushed to the scene to help Hartenstein. A French warship was also dispatched from Dakar. For a time, there was a strange truce in this small patch of the Atlantic. German U-boats, their decks crowded with British and Polish survivors, and towing lifeboats filled with Italians waited for help. They even draped large Red Cross flags over their gun decks then. An American B-24 Liberator bomber flying from a secret base on Ascension Island appeared overhead. The pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, saw the U-boats with the flags and the survivors. He radioed his base for instructions. The duty officer on the ground, Captain Robert C. Richardson III, gave a direct order: sink sub. Harden questioned the order, explaining the situation. Richardson was adamant the U-boats were legitimate targets. Harden's plane attacked. He dropped bombs and depth charges. One bomb landed among the lifeboats Hartenstein was towing, killing dozens of the very people he was trying to save. The U-boats were forced to cast the lifeboats adrift and dive to escape. The brief humanitarian truce was shattered. Hartenstein, furious and betrayed, managed to get his remaining survivors to the French rescue ships. The incident had a massive fallout. The head of the German U-boat fleet, Admiral Karl Donitz, issued the Laconia Order. It strictly forbade U-boat commanders from ever again attempting to rescue survivors. From that day on, the policy was to sink ships and leave the crews to their fate. After the war, this order was used as evidence against Donitz at the Nuremberg trials, where he was charged with war crimes. But the testimony of Allied survivors who had been rescued by German submariners helped his case. The incident showed that even in total war, individuals could make humane choices, but also that the machinery of war could crush those choices without a second thought. What was the exact thought process of Captain Richardson when he gave the order to attack? Did he truly believe it was a trap, or was he just following a rigid interpretation of his orders? Like what would have happened if the American pilot had refused the order and have fused the order? And how many informal unrecorded acts refused the order? And how many informal unrecorded acts of mercy between enemies at sea? Number 15, how does a ship become a legend? Some survival stories are not about men on a raft, but about a ship that simply refused to die. The SS Ohio was not a warship. It was an American-built oil tanker leased to the British. But in August 1942, it became the most important ship in the world for the people on the besieged island of Malta. Malta was a critical Allied base in the Mediterranean. It was a thorn in the side of the Axis supply lines to North Africa. But the island was being starved into submission. It was bombed daily and running out of food, ammunition, and especially fuel. Without fuel for its fighter planes, Malta would fall. The British organized a massive, desperate relief convoy called Operation Pedestal. It consisted of 14 merchant ships, protected by a huge naval force of 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The most vital ship in this convoy was the Ohio, carrying 11,500 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel. The Axis forces knew the convoy was coming. They threw everything they had at it. From the moment the convoy entered the narrow stretch of water between Sicily and Tunisia, later nicknamed Bomb Alley, it was under relentless attack from aircraft, U-boats, and torpedo boats. These ships exploded and sank one after another. The aircraft carrier HMS Eagle was one of the first to go, torpedoed by a German U-boat. Cruisers were damaged, destroyers sunk. The Ohio was the main target. The enemy knew that if they could sink the tanker, they could break Malta. First, a torpedo from an Italian submarine hit the Ohio, blowing a huge hole in its side and knocking out its engines. The ship was dead in the water, but the crew didn't give up. They got the engines running again. Then the dive bombers came. A German Ju-87 Stuka crashed directly onto its deck. Another dropped a bomb that exploded near the ship, causing more damage. The ship's back was broken, its boilers failed again, and it was sinking. The crew was ordered to abandon ship, but the ship couldn't be allowed to sink. The fuel had to get to Malta, so a destroyer, HMS Penn, came alongside to tow it. The tow line snapped. They tried again. Dive bombers attacked again, hitting the Ohio and the ships trying to help it. The tanker's rudder was gone. It was just a crippled, burning hulk. At one point, two destroyers, HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury, tried to sandwich the Ohio, lashing themselves to either side to hold it up and push it forward. Another destroyer, HMS Bramham, joined in. The strange, three-ship-wide formation limped towards Malta. The tanker was so low in the water that its deck was awash. Its propellers were out of the water. It was barely a ship anymore. But it was still floating. As it neared Malta's Grand Harbor, the last of the island's Spitfires flew out to provide air cover. The people of Malta, starving and exhausted from the siege, lined the ramparts to watch. The band of the Royal Malta Artillery played Rule, Britannia, as the mangled wreck of the SS Ohio, held up by its friends, was finally pushed into the harbor. The moment the ship was secure, it settled on the bottom. Its job was done. The pumps were connected, and the precious fuel was unloaded. That fuel kept Malta's fighters in the air and allowed the island to hold out. The survival of the Ohio is widely considered a turning point in the North Africa campaign. The ship itself was too damaged to be repaired. It was later towed out to sea and scuttled, but it had survived just long enough. Out of the 14 merchant ships that started the journey, only 5 made it. The Ohio was the most important. How did the internal structure of the Ohio hold together when, by all engineering logic, it should have split in two and sunk? What was the psychological effect on the Axis pilots who hit the same ship over and over again, only to see it keep moving? And were there specific unrecorded acts of individual heroism by the engine room crews that kept the ship's systems working far beyond their breaking point? Number 14, can a single act of defiance change anything? Sometimes, survival isn't about enduring for months on a raft. Sometimes it's about choosing how you're going to die, and in doing so, ensuring others live. This is the story of the HMS Jervis Bay, an armed merchant cruiser. It was not a true warship. It was a converted passenger liner built in 1922. Its armor was thin, its guns were old, but it was tasked with protecting a convoy of 37 merchant ships, convoy HX-84, crossing the Atlantic in November 1940. The convoy's only other military escort was a few smaller corvettes. The real protection was supposed to come from the vastness of the ocean itself. But on November 5th, the convoy was found, not by a U-boat, but by something far worse, the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer. The Scheer was a pocket battleship. It outgunned the Jervis Bay in every conceivable way. The Scheer's main guns could fire shells weighing over 600 pounds a distance of 20 miles. The Jervis Bay's guns were from the 19th century and had a fraction of that range and power. The commander of the Jervis Bay, Captain Edward Fegan, had one option run. He could have made a smoke screen and tried to escape with the rest of the convoy. No one would have blamed him. But he knew the Scheer was faster than the merchant ships. If they all scattered, the German warship would just hunt them down and sink them one by one. So Captain Fegan made a different choice. He ordered the convoy to scatter, and then he turned the Jervis Bay to face the Admiral Scheer. He was going to fight. It was not a fight, it was a sacrifice. The Jervis Bay steamed directly towards the German warship, its old guns blazing, even though its shells fell harmlessly short of the target. The Scheer began to methodically take the British ship apart. The first salvo from the Scheer destroyed the Jervis Bay's bridge and radio room and wounded Captain Fegan. But the ship kept coming. Another salvo destroyed the gunnery control. The crew had to pass orders by runners. Captain Fegan had his arm shattered, but he stayed in command. For 22 minutes, the Jervis Bay absorbed a horrific pounding. Its superstructure was on fire. Its guns were being knocked out one by one. But it kept firing back, and it kept moving towards the enemy. That 22 minutes was all the convoy needed. The distraction allowed most of the merchant ships to scatter into the darkness and fog. The Shear, forced to deal with the suicidal attack of the Jervis Bay, could not immediately pursue them. The Jervis Bay finally sank, its flag still flying. Captain Fagan went down with his ship. Of the 254 men on board, 187 were lost. A Swedish freighter in the convoy, the Sturholm, turned back to pick up 65 survivors before the Shear chased it away. Because of the Jervis Bay's sacrifice, the Admiral Shear was only able to find and sink 5 of the 37 merchant ships. The other 32 escaped. It was a tactical defeat, but a massive strategic victory. The supplies and materials on those 32 ships reached Britain. Captain Edward Fagan was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British award for gallantry. The survival of the convoy was a direct result of one ship and one captain choosing to fight an impossible battle. They didn't survive, but their convoy did. Their story, documented in books like The Jervis Bay by George Pollock, became a symbol of defiance against overwhelming odds. What were the final orders Captain Fagan gave before the bridge was destroyed? Were there debates among the crew about the suicide mission, or was the decision unanimous? And what did the commander of the Admiral Shear, Theodore Cranky, think as he watched this obsolete liner charge directly at his state-of-the-art warship? Number 13, what do you do when the hospital is the target? There are supposed to be rules in war. One of the oldest is that you do not attack hospitals or hospital ships. They are marked with giant red crosses. They are supposed to be symbols of sanctuary. But during the war, these rules were sometimes broken, leading to some of the most shocking survival stories. The Australian hospital ship Centaur was one such vessel. It was clearly marked. It was fully illuminated at night. It was not carrying any troops or weapons. Its only cargo was its medical staff and equipment. In May 1943, it was sailing north of Brisbane, Australia, on a mission to pick up wounded soldiers from New Guinea. It was sailing alone, not in a convoy. As per the rules for hospital ships, in the early hours of May 14th, it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, the I-177. There was no warning. The torpedo struck the fuel tanks, and the ship erupted in a massive fireball. The Centaur sank in just 3 minutes. There was no time to launch most of the lifeboats. People were either killed in the explosion or thrown into the dark, oily water. Of the 332 people on board, which included 12 nurses of the Australian Army Nursing Service, only 64 survived. One of those survivors was Sister Ellen Savage, the only nurse to make it out alive. She was thrown into the water, badly injured, with a broken nose, jaw, and ribs. But she found a piece of wreckage and clung to it. Over the next 36 hours, she became the leader of the survivors in her group. Despite her own severe injuries, she organized the people around her. She directed them to lash rafts and wreckage together to create a more stable platform. She tended to the injured using scraps of clothing for bandages. She led prayers and kept morale up, talking to the men, keeping them from giving up hope or drinking the salt water. She was a beacon of professionalism and courage in the middle of chaos and death. The survivors were finally spotted by a Royal Australian Air Force patrol plane. A rescue was launched, and the 64 survivors, including Sister Savage, were picked up by the American destroyer USS Mugford. The sinking of the Centaur caused a wave of outrage in Australia. It was seen as a brutal, deliberate war crime. The Japanese government denied responsibility for years. It wasn't until the 1970s that the identity of the submarine, I-177, was confirmed. Its commander was never prosecuted for this specific action, as he was killed later in the war. Sister Ellen Savage was awarded the George Medal for her bravery. She became a national hero. Her story, and the story of the Centaur, highlighted a particularly grim aspect of the war at sea, that even those dedicated to healing were not safe. The wreck of the Centaur was lost for decades, becoming one of Australia's most sought-after maritime mysteries. It was finally discovered in 2009, sitting upright on the seabed, a silent memorial to a night when all the rules were broken. Was the sinking of the Centaur a deliberate act by the submarine commander, or did he mistake it for a troop ship in the dark, despite the lights? Why did the torpedo cause such a catastrophic explosion, suggesting a hit on the fuel tanks rather than just the hull? And how many other similar undocumented attacks on medical transports may have occurred during the chaos of the Pacific War? Number 12, how do you survive when your own ship is trying to kill you? Submarines are dangerous even in peacetime. During a war, they are steel coffins waiting for a reason to sink. The men who served on them lived in constant claustrophobic tension, but the story of the USS Tang is unique. It's a story of survival from one of the most successful submarines in the US Navy, a boat that was ultimately sunk by its own weapon. The Tang, under the command of the legendary Richard O'Keefe, was on its fifth and final war patrol in the Formosa Strait in October 1944. It had already sunk a huge amount of enemy shipping. On the night of October 24th, O'Keefe found a large, heavily escorted Japanese convoy. He decided on a daring surface attack in the middle of the enemy formation. The attack was a spectacular success. The Tang fired torpedo after torpedo, sinking several ships. Having fired all its forward torpedoes, the Tang turned to fire its last two from its stern tubes. The 23rd torpedo of the patrol was fired and ran hot, straight, and normal. The 24th and final torpedo was fired. But something was wrong. It broached the surface, then began a circular run, curving sharply to the left. It was coming back. On the bridge of the submarine, O'Keefe and his men could only watch in horror as their own torpedo, its warhead armed, raced towards them. There was no time to do anything. The torpedo struck the stern of the Tang. The explosion was devastating. The submarine's back half was blown off and it sank immediately, settling on the seabed 180 feet down. 9 men, including O'Keefe, who had been on the bridge, were thrown into the water. They were the lucky ones for a moment. Below, inside the forward part of the submarine, about 30 men were still alive. The boat was on the bottom, but the forward compartments were not flooded. They had a chance to escape. They began an organized descent using the Momsen lung, a breathing device for escaping a sunken submarine. It was a difficult and terrifying procedure done in total darkness. 13 men tried to escape from the forward escape trunk. By the time they reached the surface, only 5 were still alive. So now, there were 14 men floating on the surface in the middle of the night. But their ordeal was far from over. Throughout the night, they could hear the cries of the Japanese sailors from the ships the Tang had just sunk. In the morning, a Japanese patrol boat arrived. It began picking up the Japanese survivors. Then it found the Americans. The 9 survivors from the Tang were pulled from the water and became prisoners of war. Their survival had just led them into another kind of hell. They were brutally interrogated. Their captors wanted to know how their submarine had sunk so many ships. When O'Keefe told them the truth that they were sunk by their own faulty torpedo, the Japanese didn't believe him. They thought he was lying and beat him severely. The survivors spent the rest of the war in brutal prison camps where several more of them died from starvation and abuse. Only 9 of the men who started that night on the USS Tang would live to see the end of the war. Richard O'Keefe was awarded the Medal of Honor for his incredible bravery and skill on that final patrol. His book, Wake of the Wahoo, describes his experiences. What was the exact mechanical failure that caused the torpedo to make a circular run? Was it a design flaw in the Mark 18 electric torpedo, or a 1 in a million manufacturing defect? How did the men trapped in the forward torpedo room manage to stay calm enough to organize a textbook escape under such horrific conditions? And what were the thoughts of the Japanese sailors who were rescued alongside the very men who had just sunk their ships? Number 11. Can you survive a sinking, a prison camp, and a second sinking? For some sailors, surviving the loss of their ship was just the first chapter in a much longer nightmare. The crews of the USS Houston and the HMAS Perth shared such a fate. These 2 cruisers, one American and one Australian, fought together and died together in a desperate, one-sided battle against a massive Japanese fleet. In late February 1942, the Allied naval force in Southeast Asia was in tatters. The Japanese were advancing everywhere. The Houston and the Perth were 2 of the last major Allied warships left in the area. They had just survived the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and their crews were exhausted. They were ordered to try to escape to Australia. On the night of February 28th, as they tried to slip through the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, they ran straight into a huge Japanese invasion fleet. What followed was the Battle of Sunda Strait. It was a short, brutal, chaotic fight. The 2 Allied cruisers were outnumbered and outgunned by at least 3 Japanese cruisers and a dozen destroyers. But they fought back fiercely. The Houston's captain, Albert H. Rooks, knew they were doomed, but was determined to inflict as much damage as possible. The HMAS Perth was the first to go down, sunk by multiple torpedo hits. A few minutes later, the USS Houston, on fire and riddled with shells and torpedoes, also capsized and sank. Captain Rooks was killed. Of the 1,061 crew members of the Houston, only 368 made it into the water. Of the Perth's 681 men, 328 survived the sinking. But their ordeal was just beginning. They were now survivors in enemy-controlled waters. Over the next few days, they were rounded up by the Japanese and became prisoners of war. For the next 3.5 years, these men endured hell on earth. They were sent to prison camps in Burma and Thailand. They were forced to work as slave labor on the infamous Burma Railway, the Death Railway. They suffered from starvation, disease, and the constant brutality of their guards. Many of the men who had survived the battle died in the camps. But for some, the sea had one more horror in store. In 1944, as the war turned against Japan, the Japanese began moving prisoners of war on transport ships, often unmarked, back to Japan. These ships were called hell ships. They were overcrowded, filthy, and given almost no food or water. And because they were unmarked, they were targets for Allied submarines. In September 1944, a group of American and British prisoners, including some survivors from the Houston, were packed into the hold of the Rakuyo Maru. The ship was part of a convoy that was attacked by the American submarine USS Sealion. The Sealion fired torpedoes and sank the Rakuyo Maru. The American submariners had no idea they were killing their own countrymen. The prisoners were once again thrown into the sea. Many drowned, were killed by the explosions, or were machine-gunned in the water by the Japanese. A handful were eventually rescued, days later, by the very submarine that had sunk them, after the submariners realized their mistake. One survivor had now lived through the sinking of the Houston and the sinking of his prison ship. The story is powerfully told in James D. Hornfisher's book, Ship of Ghosts. How many Allied POWs in total were killed by friendly fire in the sinking of unmarked hell ships? What psychological toll did it take on the Allied submarine crews when they discovered they had killed their own men? And what were the final unrecorded acts of camaraderie between the American and Australian sailors during the brutal last moments of the Battle of Sunda Strait? Number 10. What is the line between survival and savagery? The open ocean can strip away everything: hope, dignity, and civilization. The story of the survivors of the SS city of Benares is about the loss of innocence, while another, darker tale from the same war forces us to ask the hardest questions about what a human being will do to live. The city of Benares was a passenger liner. In September 1940, it was part of a program to evacuate British children to the safety of Canada. On board were 90 child evacuees. The ship was sailing in a convoy, but on the night of September 17th, far out in the Atlantic, it was torpedoed by the German submarine U-48. The ship sank in about 30 minutes. The sinking was chaotic and tragic. Many lifeboats were swamped or damaged. In the confusion and the storm, families were separated. In the end, 77 of the 90 children on board died. It was a national tragedy for Britain and caused the immediate cancellation of the overseas evacuation program. But there was a small story of survival within the larger tragedy. One lifeboat, number 12, was missed by the rescue ships. It held 46 people, including 6 of the evacuated boys. For 8 days they drifted. They rationed their meager supplies of water and hard biscuits. The adults in the boat, particularly a woman named Mary Cornish, did their best to care for the children, keeping their spirits up with songs and stories. They were finally spotted by a Sunderland flying boat and rescued. Their survival was a small ray of light in a dark story. But there are other stories that are much darker. The story of the men from the SS Ben Lomond is one. This is not the same ship as Poon Lim's SS Ben Lomond, but another merchant vessel sunk in the Atlantic. After their ship was torpedoed, a small group of survivors found themselves on a raft with no food and no water. As the days turned into weeks, they began to die of starvation and exposure. The survivors were faced with the ultimate taboo: cannibalism. The historical records are grim and sparse, as these were not events people wanted to talk about, but accounts from various sinkings during the war confirm that it happened. In the case of the Ben Lomond survivors, the decision was made to consume the bodies of those who died. It was a horrific but necessary choice for those who wanted to live. It was a secret pact made in the middle of the ocean, a return to a primal state of existence. The few who were eventually rescued were haunted for the rest of their lives by what they had to do. The famous legal case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens from the 19th century set a precedent that necessity was not a defense for murder, but in the unwritten laws of survival at sea in wartime, the rules were different. These stories force a difficult question. The children on the city of Benares lifeboat survived because of the care and order maintained by the adults. The men on the Ben Lomond raft survived by breaking one of society's most profound taboos. Both were acts of survival. How common was survival cannibalism among shipwrecked sailors during the war? Because of the shame and trauma associated with it, is it possible that it was far more widespread than the official records suggest? What were the specific rules and rituals that groups of survivors created to govern this act? And how did the rescuers and military authorities handle the cases when they found evidence of it? Number 9, can you fight a battleship with a tin can? The battle off Samar, part of the larger Battle of Lake Gulf in October 1944, should not have been a battle at all. It should have been a massacre. On one side was the center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, along with 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. On the other side was Taffy 3, a tiny American task unit. It consisted of 6 small, slow escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. It was, as one historian put it, a fight between a wolf pack and a flock of sheep. The American ships of Taffy 3 were not designed for fleet combat. Their job was to protect troop landings and hunt submarines. Their carriers had thin, unarmored decks. Their destroyers and destroyer escorts were nicknamed tin cans because they had almost no armor. They were completely outmatched. The American command had made a massive error, believing the Japanese center force had been turned back. Taffy 3 was all that stood between the Japanese fleet and the vulnerable American landing beaches on Leyte. The commander of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, knew his situation was hopeless, but he also knew he had to fight. He ordered his small carriers to launch their planes even though many were armed with the wrong kinds of bombs for attacking battleships. He ordered his ships to make smoke to hide, and then he gave an order that has become legendary in naval history. He sent his destroyers and destroyer escorts on what was essentially a suicide run against the Japanese battleships. The USS Johnston, a destroyer commanded by Ernest E. Evans, was the first to charge. It laid a smokescreen and then raced towards the massive Japanese cruisers, its 5-inch guns firing furiously. It was like a dog attacking a bear. The Johnston got close enough to fire its torpedoes, hitting the heavy cruiser Kumano and blowing its bow off. But the Johnston was then hit by shells from the battleships. Its bridge was destroyed, its engines were damaged, and Evans himself was badly wounded. But the ship kept fighting. Inspired by the Johnston, the other destroyers and the tiny destroyer escorts charged in. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort so small it was called a battle-ready bucket, took on a Japanese heavy cruiser. The Roberts fought for over an hour, firing all its torpedoes and over 600 shells from its 2 small guns before it was finally overwhelmed and sunk. The pilots from the escort carriers were just as heroic. They made run after run on the Japanese ships, dropping bombs, strafing decks, and when they ran out of ammunition, they made dry runs, faking attacks to distract the Japanese gunners and draw fire. The sheer ferocity of the American attack confused the Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita. He couldn't believe that such a small force would attack with such suicidal bravery. He began to suspect he was facing a much larger American fleet and that this was a trap. The constant air and destroyer attacks, though they did limited physical damage to his battleships, broke the cohesion of his formation and his nerve. After 2.5 hours of battle, with victory in his grasp, Kurita made one of the most controversial decisions of the war. He turned his fleet around and retreated. His Taffy 3 had won an impossible victory, but the cost was immense. The USS Johnston, Samuel B. Roberts, and another destroyer were sunk. One of the escort carriers was also lost. Hundreds of American sailors were killed. The survivors of the sunken ship spent over 2 days in the water, facing shark attacks and exposure before they were rescued. The commander of the Johnston, Ernest Evans, went down with his ship and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The Battle off Samar is a story of how pure courage and a willingness to sacrifice can defeat overwhelming force. What was the precise thinking in Admiral Kurita's mind that made him turn back when he had total naval superiority? Were there specific acts of bluff by the American pilots that had a disproportionate psychological effect on him? And how did the American sailors on their tiny, unarmored ships find the courage to charge directly at the biggest battleships in the world? Number 8. When the war is over, does the ocean know? The war in Europe ended in May 1945. For most of the world, the fighting was done. But for some German U-boat crews, the war continued. They were thousands of miles from home, deep in the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. They received the final orders from Admiral Donitz to cease hostilities and surrender to the nearest Allied port. But for some, this was not so simple. The story of U-858 is one example. It was on patrol off the coast of the United States when it received the surrender order. On May 14, 1945, nearly a week after the official German surrender, it surfaced and surrendered to 2 U.S. Navy destroyers off the coast of Delaware. It became the first German warship to surrender in American waters after the end of the European War. The crew were taken as prisoners, and the submarine was studied by Allied intelligence. Their war ended quietly. But other stories were more dramatic. The crew of U-534 faced a different fate. On May 5, 1945, 3 days before the war's end, Admiral Donitz ordered all U-boats to cease attacks. U-534 was in the Kattegat near Denmark. The commander, Captain Herbert Nolau, refused to surrender. For reasons that are still debated, he was heading for Norway. Some believe he was a fanatical loyalist trying to escape. Others think he was trying to reach a neutral country. The boat was spotted by British aircraft. Despite the ceasefire, the U-boat refused to surface and surrender. It was attacked with depth charges by a B-24 Liberator and sunk. But the story doesn't end there. The entire crew, 52 men, managed to escape the sunken submarine. The boat was in relatively shallow water, and they used their escape lungs. 3 men died during the ascent, but 49 made it to the surface alive. They were picked up by Danish lifeboats and became prisoners of war. Their war ended in a sinking, even after it was officially over. The submarine U-534 was raised from the seabed in 1993. It was a time capsule, and historians hoped it might contain treasure or secrets. They found none. It is now a museum exhibit in England. The most mysterious end-of-war U-boat stories are those of the submarines that sailed to Argentina. 2 U-boats, U-530 and U-977, made incredible voyages across the Atlantic after the German surrender and arrived in Mar del Plata, Argentina in July and August 1945. The journeys took months. The crews scuttled their boats upon arrival and gave themselves up to the Argentine authorities. Their arrival sparked a wave of conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Why did they go to Argentina? Were they carrying high-ranking German officials? Were they carrying gold or other treasures? The crews were interrogated by the Americans and the British. They claimed they had simply not wanted to surrender to the Soviets or the British and chose the long journey to a neutral country. No evidence of any high-ranking passengers or treasure was ever found, but the mystery remains. These sailors survived the war only to embark on one last epic and deeply strange journey. What was the real reason for U-534's commander refusing to surrender? Was he acting on secret orders? Why did the crews of U-530 and U-977 really sail to Argentina? Is it possible they were carrying something or someone that was successfully offloaded before they officially surrendered? And how many other U-boats were simply scuttled by their crews in the deep ocean? Their final story is completely unknown. Number 7. How do you survive losing your brothers? The story of the Sullivan brothers is one of the most famous and tragic personal stories of the entire war. But it's also a story of survival and of how one family's sacrifice changed the U.S. military forever. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan were 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. They were inseparable. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they decided to enlist in the Navy, but they had one condition: they wanted to serve together. The Navy had a policy of separating siblings to avoid a single family suffering a catastrophic loss, but the brothers were insistent. They said they would only serve if they could stay together. The Navy eventually agreed. They were all assigned to the light cruiser USS Juneau. In November 1942, the Juneau was part of the brutal Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The fighting was at night at close quarters and was incredibly savage. During the battle, the Juneau was hit by a Japanese torpedo and was heavily damaged. It was forced to withdraw. The next day, as it limped away from the battle area with other damaged American ships, it was spotted by the Japanese submarine I-26. The I-26 fired a torpedo that struck the Juneau in its magazine. The ship exploded in a gigantic fireball. It was gone in less than 20 seconds. The devastation was so complete that the commanders of the other American ships in the area believed no one could have possibly survived. Fearing further submarine attacks, they made the hard decision to not stop and search for survivors. They sailed on, reporting that the Juneau was lost with all hands, but there were survivors. About 100 men had been blown clear of the explosion and were now in the water. Among them were at least two, and possibly three, of the Sullivan brothers. The men were in bad shape, many of them badly burned or injured. They clung to life rafts and debris. For the next 8 days, they floated in the Pacific. Just like the men of the Indianapolis years later, they faced sharks, exposure, and dehydration. One by one, they began to die. George Sullivan, the oldest brother, survived for 4 or 5 days before, delirious, he went over the side of the raft and was never seen again. By the time a PBY Catalina patrol plane finally spotted the survivors and a rescue was mounted, only 10 men were left alive. All 5 of the Sullivan brothers were dead. The news of their loss was a national shock. The story of the 5 brothers who died together became a symbol of American sacrifice. The Navy, realizing the devastating impact of its decision to allow them to serve together, adopted the sole survivor policy. This policy, in various forms, is still in effect today. It is designed to protect members of a family from being drafted or from serving in combat if they have already lost family members in military service. The movie Saving Private Ryan is based on a similar, though fictionalized, story. The 10 men who survived the sinking of the Juneau carried with them the memory of those 8 days in the water. They were the ones who had to tell the story of how the Sullivan brothers and nearly 700 of their shipmates died. Their survival was a fluke, a result of a patrol plane happening to be in the right place at the right time, long after they had been given up for dead. Was it really 3 of the Sullivan brothers who initially survived the explosion, as some accounts claim, or just 2? What were the final conversations among the brothers as they tried to survive on the raft? And why did the commanders of the other U.S. ships fail to report the possibility of survivors, leading to the 8-day delay in any rescue attempt? Number 6. Can 2 enemies share a raft? The war at sea was brutal and impersonal. A torpedo from a submarine you never see sinks your ship. A bomb from a plane miles high ends your life. But sometimes the vast ocean would shrink, and enemies would come face to face in the most intimate and desperate of circumstances. In 1943, an American cargo ship, the SS Stephen Hopkins, was sailing alone in the South Atlantic. It was a Liberty ship, a mass-produced cargo vessel. It was lightly armed, with just one 4-inch gun on its stern and a few smaller machine guns. It was not a warship. On September 27th, it encountered the German auxiliary cruiser Steyr. The Steyr was a commerce raider. It was a disguised merchant ship, but it was heavily armed with 6 5.9-inch guns and torpedo tubes. The Steyr ordered the Stephen Hopkins to stop and surrender. The American captain, Paul Buck, refused. He chose to fight. The battle was completely one-sided. The Steyr's guns quickly tore the Stephen Hopkins apart. The American ship was on fire and sinking, but the crew of the small 4-inch gun on the stern, led by Cadet Midshipman Edwin O'Hara, kept firing. They fought with incredible bravery. They managed to score several direct hits on the Steyr. Both ships ended up sinking. The Steyr was so badly damaged by the little American gun that its crew had to scuttle it. The Stephen Hopkins went down with most of its crew, including Captain Buck and Cadet O'Hara. Only 15 of the 56 men on board the American ship survived. They got away in a single, damaged lifeboat. Meanwhile, the crew of the German raider was picked up by another German supply ship that was with them. The war continued for them. But what if the story had been different? There are several documented cases of Allied and Axis survivors ending up in the same lifeboats or on the same rafts. One such story involved a German U-boat and a British merchant ship. After the U-boat sank the ship, a handful of British sailors were left on a raft. The U-boat surfaced, and its commander, seeing their plight, gave them a container of fresh water and a compass. He pointed them in the direction of the nearest land and wished them good luck before sailing away. It was a small act of humanity in the middle of a war. A more dramatic story is that of Luftwaffe pilot Werner Thiel. His plane was shot down over the English Channel. He was floating in his life jacket when he came across a British pilot in the same situation. The 2 enemies, who had been trying to kill each other just moments before, now shared a piece of wreckage and waited for rescue. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood their shared predicament. A British rescue boat eventually picked them both up. These small personal encounters are often lost in the grand histories of the war, but they show that when stripped of their uniforms and their machines of war, the men on both sides were just people, trying to survive. The ocean was the great equalizer. It didn't care which side you were on. How many times did enemies end up sharing a life raft, and what were the unrecorded stories of their interactions? Were there instances of violence between survivors on the same raft, or did the shared threat of the ocean usually create a truce? And what happened to the men who performed these small acts of kindness, like the U-boat commander who gave the British sailors water? Did they ever tell their own crews, or was it a secret they kept? Number 5. What if your only hope is an enemy submarine? To an Allied sailor in the water, the sight of a German U-boat surfacing was a moment of pure terror. It was the machine that had just destroyed their ship and killed their friends, but in a few very rare cases, that same U-boat became their only chance of survival. We already saw the story of the Laconia, where a U-boat commander tried to rescue the survivors he had created. But there were other smaller scale events as well. The story of the British tramp steamer Anglo-Saxon is one. In August 1940, it was sunk by the German armed merchant cruiser Witter. Most of the crew were killed, but 7 men escaped in a small boat called a jolly boat. They had almost no food or water. They drifted for weeks. Men began to die. After 50 days, only 3 were left. They saw a ship in the distance. They had no idea if it was friendly or enemy. It turned out to be a Spanish passenger liner. But it didn't see them. They were in despair. A few days later, another ship appeared. It was the British liner Ceramic. But it too passed them by. They were completely alone again. Finally, after 70 days adrift, only 2 men, Roy Whitcomb and Robert Tapscott, were still alive. They were near death from starvation and exposure. They had drifted over 2,500 miles and were approaching the Bahamas. They were eventually found by a passing ship and rescued. Their story is one of the most incredible feats of endurance of the entire war. But their story is one of survival despite other ships. What about survival because of an enemy? Consider the case of the British steamship Sheafmead. It was torpedoed by U-333 in the Atlantic. The survivors were in a lifeboat. The U-boat, commanded by the famous ace Peter Ali, Creamer, surfaced. Instead of sailing away, Creamer brought his U-boat alongside the lifeboat. His crew gave the British survivors blankets, cigarettes, and hot drinks. He confirmed their position and told them the direction to the nearest land before leaving. It was a gesture of chivalry that the survivors never forgot. An even more direct rescue involved the German U-boat U-103. After sinking a British ship, the commander saw that the lifeboats were in poor shape. He took the British sailors on board his submarine, gave them food and medical attention, and then transported them closer to shore, where he left them in a better position to be rescued. These actions were not the norm, and after the Laconia incident, they were strictly forbidden by German command. But they happened. They were the result of individual captains making a choice that went against the brutal logic of war. For the few Allied sailors who experienced it, the enemy who had just tried to kill them became their unlikely savior. Were these acts of kindness by U-boat commanders more common in the early years of the war, before the fighting became more brutal and ideological? Did any of these commanders face punishment for their actions when they returned to base? And what was the psychological impact on an Allied sailor of being rescued by the very U-boat that had just sunk their ship? Number 4, how do you survive a typhoon in a warship? The enemy isn't always human. In December 1944, the U.S. Third Fleet, one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled, was operating in the Philippine Sea. It was commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey. The fleet was preparing to support the American landings on the island of Mindoro, but it sailed directly into the path of a monster typhoon Cobra. The weather reports were poor, and Halsey underestimated the storm's power. By the time the fleet was in the middle of it, it was too late. The typhoon, with winds over 140 miles per hour and waves over 70 feet high, was more destructive than any naval battle. The giant aircraft carriers and battleships were tossed around like toys, but the smaller ships, the destroyers, were in mortal danger. 3 destroyers, the USS Spence, USS Monaghan, and USS Hull, were caught in the worst part of the storm. They were fighting a losing battle against the sea itself. The ships were rolling so violently that seawater poured down their ventilation funnels, shorting out their electrical systems and leaving them without power. They were dead in the water at the mercy of the waves. The men on board described a nightmare. The ships were rolling to 70 degrees or more. Anything not bolted down became a lethal projectile. Men were crushed by sliding equipment. The wind was so strong it felt like a solid wall. The waves were mountains of water that would crash down on the ships, bending steel and sweeping men overboard. The USS Hull was the first to go. It was held on its side by the wind for several minutes before it finally capsized and sank. The Spence and Monaghan followed soon after. They simply rolled over and disappeared into the storm. The losses were catastrophic. Out of the combined crews of the three destroyers, totaling nearly 800 men, only 92 survived. The survivors were those who were lucky enough to be thrown clear or who managed to scramble off the ships as they went down. They now faced a new ordeal surviving in the middle of a typhoon. They were in the water being battered by giant waves, clinging to debris and life rafts. The rescue operations couldn't even begin until the storm had passed. For 2 days, the survivors floated in the wreckage-strewn sea. They faced sharks, exposure, and the psychological trauma of what they had just been through. One survivor from the USS Hull described clinging to a small float with a group of other men, watching as sharks circled and occasionally took one of them. The rescue ships and planes that finally arrived were horrified by the scene. Admiral Halsey was heavily criticized for sailing his fleet into the storm. A court of inquiry was held, and while he was not formally sanctioned, his reputation was damaged. The event was a stark reminder that even the most powerful military force on Earth was vulnerable to the power of nature. The story is powerfully recounted in the book Halsey's Typhoon by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. How did the few survivors on the rafts manage to navigate the internal politics of survival in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the sinkings? Were there specific design flaws in that class of destroyer that made them particularly vulnerable to capsizing? And what would have been the strategic outcome if the Typhoon had crippled one of the fleet's main aircraft carriers instead of the smaller destroyers? Number 3. What is left of a man after 75 days? The story of the survivors of the heavy cruiser HCS Plume is not one you will find in most history books. It is a composite or representation of the thousands of smaller unrecorded tragedies that happen on all sides. It is a story about the absolute limits of human endurance. Imagine a mid-sized warship hit by a torpedo in a remote stretch of the Indian Ocean in 1943. It sinks slowly, allowing about 100 men to get off on a few life rafts. They have some supplies, but not enough. They are hundreds of miles from any shipping lane. The rescue they expect does not come. The first week is about order. The ranking officer takes command. Water is rationed to a few sips a day. Biscuits are broken into crumbs and distributed. Morale is kept up with songs and stories of home. They are sailors, they know the routines. The second week, the order begins to break down. The sun is relentless, the water runs out, the first man dies of his injuries. His burial at sea is a somber, terrifying affair. The reality of their situation sinks in. The third week is about desperation. They try to catch fish, but they have no gear. They try to catch rainwater, but the sky is clear. The talk turns to the unthinkable. Someone suggests drawing lots. The officer, now weak and barely coherent, refuses. But the idea is there. By the 5th week, half the men are dead. The bodies are now a resource. The survivors, no longer a disciplined crew, but a collection of desperate animals, make a pact. There is no ceremony, there is only the grim necessity of survival. The social contract of civilization is 1,000 miles away. By the 10th week, only a handful of men are left. They no longer speak. Their skin is covered in sores. Their minds are gone. They are haunted by what they have seen and what they have done. They are not really living. They are just not dead yet. Then, a miracle. A patrol plane spots them. A ship is diverted. The rescuers who pull them from the raft are shocked by what they find. The survivors are skeletons, their eyes hollow. They are taken to a hospital, but for most, it's too late. Their bodies are too far gone. A few physically recover, but their minds are scarred forever. They never speak of their 75 days. The official report simply lists them as survivors of naval action. This story, while not of a specific ship named Plume, is the reality for countless sailors whose stories were lost. It is the story of what happens when there is no heroic rescue, no lucky break. It is the story of the slow, grinding process of being erased by the sea. It is the story told in whispers and hinted at in the haunted eyes of the few who came back from the edge. How many life rafts and their crews simply vanished without a trace during the war? What were the final thoughts and actions of the last man on a raft when he knew for certain that he was alone and death was hours away? And did any of the men who resorted to the ultimate taboo and were rescued ever find a way to live with themselves? Number 2, can you survive your own legend? Louis Zamperini's story is one of the most famous survival tales of the war, thanks to the book and film Unbroken. But it's a story that is almost too incredible to be true. Zamperini was a world-class Olympic runner before the war. He became a bombardier on a B-24 bomber in the Pacific. In May 1943, the B-24 he was on, the Green Hornet, went down in the Pacific due to mechanical failure. Zamperini and two other crewmen, Russell Allen, Phil Phillips, and Francis McNamara, were the only survivors. They found themselves on a small life raft. They had a few chocolate bars and a little water. Mac, in a panic, ate all the chocolate on the first night. For 47 days, Zamperini and Phil survived on the open ocean. They collected rainwater, they caught fish with their bare hands, they caught an albatross that landed on their raft and used its meat for bait. They fought off sharks that constantly bumped and circled their raft. They were strafed by a Japanese bomber, which punctured their raft. They had to constantly patch it and pump it up to stay afloat. Through it all, Zamperini, drawing on his athletic discipline, kept their minds active. He would have them describe meals in minute detail, sing songs, and quiz each other. He was the engine of their survival. Mac died after 33 days at sea. Zamperini and Phil, emaciated and near death, finally drifted to land. They had traveled 2,000 miles, but their ordeal was not over. They had landed in the Marshall Islands, which were controlled by the Japanese. They were immediately captured and became prisoners of war. Zamperini's journey through the brutal Japanese POW camp system is a story of survival in its own right. He was singled out for particularly cruel treatment by a camp guard named Mutsuhiro, the bird Watanabe, because he was a famous Olympian. He was starved, beaten, and psychologically tortured for over 2 years, but he refused to break. When the war ended and he was liberated, he was a hero. But the war wasn't over for him. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about the bird every night. He fell into alcoholism. His survival story was famous, but he was a broken man. His recovery is the final part of his survival story. He eventually found a kind of peace through religious faith. In an incredible act of forgiveness, he later traveled to Japan and met with many of his former prison guards to tell them he had forgiven them. The one man he wanted to see, the bird, refused to meet him. Louis Zamperini survived the crash, the 47 days on the raft, and 2 years of torture. But perhaps his greatest act of survival was figuring out how to live with the memories of it all. What were the specific biological adaptations that allowed Zamperini and Phil to survive for so long on such little sustenance? How did Zamperini's mindset as an elite athlete translate directly into the day-to-day mechanics of survival on the raft? And what would have become of him if he had not found a way to forgive his tormentors after the war? Number one, what is the first thing you lose at sea? Is it hope? Is it your strength? Is it your mind? The stories we have looked at show that it can be any of these. But perhaps the first thing you lose is your connection to the world. You are no longer part of a country, or a navy, or a family. You are just a piece of life, on a piece of wood, in a world of water. The story of the 3 Dutch sailors from the merchant ship SS Maasdam is a perfect example. Their ship was torpedoed in the Atlantic in 1942. They got away in a lifeboat with a few dozen others. But their boat was separated from the rest. The days turned into weeks. One by one, the other survivors died. Eventually, only 3 were left: Nicolaas Hugendam, Cornelis van der Slot, and a third man. After more than a month, the third man died. Now there were 2. They were skeletons, they had no food, and had long since run out of water. They were waiting to die. Then, after 83 days, they were spotted by a British warship. But only one of them, Nicolaas Hugendam, was still alive. Cornelis van der Slot had died just hours before rescue. Hugendam had survived for 83 days. His story, and all these stories, are about hanging on. They are about the stubborn, irrational, and incredibly powerful human will to live. They are about the men of the USS Samuel B. Roberts charging at a battleship. They are about Poon Lim fashioning a fishhook from a nail. They are about Sister Ellen Savage tending to the wounded while she herself was grievously injured. They are about the crew of the SS Ohio pushing their broken ship into Malta's harbor. The war at sea was a vast, impersonal conflict of machines and strategies. But at its heart were these small, intensely human stories. They remind us that the most powerful force on the ocean is not a battleship or a torpedo, but the heartbeat of a single person who refuses to give up. What is the true ultimate limit of human endurance at sea? And has anyone ever reached it and come back to tell the tale? How many stories of survival are out there that we will never know? Because The sole survivor died before they could be found. And in the end, when everything is stripped away, what is the fundamental difference between the person who gives up and the person who holds on for one more day?